September 23, 2017. A container ship flying the Sri Lankan flag sits motionless in Hambantota port. The crew hasn't been paid in 6 weeks. The harbor, built with $1.4 billion in Chinese loans, gleams in the tropical sun. Brand new cranes tower over empty berths. State-of-the-art warehouses stand vacant. The port was supposed to be Sri Lanka's gateway to prosperity. Instead, it became a foreclosure notice. We think China is expanding through military aggression, through aircraft carriers and territorial disputes. We're watching the wrong battlefield. China didn't conquer Sri Lanka. It repossessed it. The war isn't happening on maps marked with troop movements. It's happening in ledgers marked with interest rates. And by the time most nations realize they're under attack, the balance sheet has already declared them bankrupt. 20 years ago, China emerged from decades of isolation with an economy growing at rates that defied gravity. Double-digit growth year after year. Factories multiplying across the coastline. Skyscrapers erupting from rice paddies. The world watched in awe as a nation of 1.3 billion people transformed into the workshop of the planet. By 2008, China held $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves, more cash than any nation in history. The Chinese Communist Party stood atop a mountain of capital with nowhere to invest it domestically without triggering inflation. So they looked outward, not with tanks. With checkbooks, the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013 as the largest infrastructure program since the Marshall Plan. Except this wasn't charity. This was strategic investment disguised as development aid. China would finance roads, railways, ports, and power plants across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Over 150 countries signed agreements. The total pledged investment exceeded $1 trillion. Think about the scale of that. $1 trillion flowing out of Beijing into nations that had been starving for infrastructure capital for generations. Roads that took decades to plan were suddenly funded overnight. Ports that governments couldn't afford were breaking ground within months. It looked like a miracle. It was a trap. China approaches a developing nation with an offer. We'll build you a deep water port, or a highway, or a power grid. We'll provide the loan, the engineers, the workers, everything. The host government just needs to sign the contract, and the contracts are always the same. High interest rates, typically 2 to 6% above market. Collateral requirements tied to the infrastructure itself or to natural resources. And a clause buried in the fine print that gives China operational control if the debt cannot be repaid. Most governments don't read the fine print. They see the gleaming renderings of modernization and sign. The construction begins. Chinese state-owned companies pour in. They bring their own workers, their own materials, their own supply chains. The local economy gets minimal benefit, and the debt clock starts ticking immediately. Sri Lanka was the test case. The pilot program for a model that would be replicated across continents. In 2007, the Sri Lankan government borrowed $307 million from China to begin construction on Hambantota port. Then another loan, then another. By 2017, the total debt had ballooned to $1.4 billion. The port was operational, but economically useless, too far from major shipping lanes. No major carriers wanted to dock there. Revenue projections missed targets by 90%. Sri Lanka couldn't make the debt payments. So China made an offer: convert the debt into equity. hand over operational control of the port for 99 years in exchange for $1.1 billion in debt relief. Sri Lanka had no choice. In December 2017, the deal was signed, and Sri Lanka had just sold a piece of its sovereignty to stay solvent. The model replicated like a virus. Pakistan borrowed $62 billion for the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The centerpiece was Gwadar Port, which China now operates on a 40-year lease. Djibouti, a tiny nation on the Horn of Africa, borrowed $1.4 billion, an amount equal to 88% of its entire GDP. When payments faltered, China took control of the port and built its first overseas military base right next door. Kenya borrowed $5 billion for a railway from Nairobi to Mombasa. The railway operates at a loss. The debt payments consume 10% of Kenya's annual budget, and the contract includes a clause that any disputes will be settled under Chinese law in Chinese courts. Think about that. A sovereign African nation signed away its legal jurisdiction to Beijing. That's not a loan. That's a surrender. The antagonist in this story isn't a general or a dictator. It's the Export-Import Bank of China and the China Development Bank. These institutions lent over $462 billion to foreign governments between 2008 and 2019, more than the World Bank, more than all Western development banks combined. But unlike the World Bank, Chinese lenders don't require transparency. They don't publish terms. They don't demand anti-corruption measures. They just require collateral and payment. Always payment. The debt becomes a noose, tightening slowly, invisibly, until the borrower realizes they can't breathe. By 2020, at least 8 countries were spending more than 20% of their government revenue just on debt payments to China. Pakistan, Djibouti, the Maldives, Laos, Mongolia, Montenegro, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. They couldn't default. Default would mean losing access to Chinese markets, losing the infrastructure China built, losing face on the international stage. So they borrowed more to pay the interest on what they already owed. Classic debt trap, the kind that destroyed entire dynasties throughout history. Except this time the dynasty being destroyed wasn't Chinese. It was everyone else. The genius of China's strategy is that it doesn't require military force. It requires patience and accounting. Every port China finances becomes a data point. Every railway becomes leverage. Every power plant becomes a pressure point. When a country owes you billions, you don't need to threaten invasion. You just need to call the loan. In 2011, China lent Venezuela $50 billion. Repayment was structured in oil shipments, 300,000 barrels per day, sent directly to China, regardless of market price. When oil crashed in 2014, dropping from $110 per barrel to $26, Venezuela kept shipping. $6 billion worth of oil flowing to China annually, while Venezuelan citizens starved. The debt was being paid in blood and hunger, but it was being paid. Here's the number that should terrify you. As of 2023, China has lent over $838 billion to foreign governments through the Belt and Road Initiative. At least 44 countries owe debt to China exceeding 10% of their GDP. 18 countries have already restructured their debt. Restructuring is a polite word. It means they couldn't pay, so they surrendered more control, more ports, more land leases, more mining rights, more sovereignty. The ledger doesn't care about national pride. It cares about balance, and the balance is tilted entirely in China's favor. July 26, 2022. A meeting room in Colombo, Sri Lanka. Government officials sit across from Chinese bankers. Sri Lanka has just defaulted on its entire $51 billion foreign debt. The country has run out of foreign currency reserves. It cannot import fuel, medicine, or food. Protests have toppled the government. The new leadership is begging for relief. The Chinese delegation listens politely. Then they present the terms. Debt restructuring will require extending lease agreements, expanding operational control to additional infrastructure, granting preferential access to telecommunications networks. The Sri Lankan officials stare at the documents. One of them later described it as reading a foreclosure notice on your own country. There was no negotiation, just terms, sign or collapse. They signed. This is the smoking gun moment. Not a single document, but a pattern repeated across dozens of nations. The Belt and Road Initiative contracts all contain similar clauses. Confidentiality agreements that prevent governments from disclosing terms. Arbitration clauses that route disputes to Chinese courts. Cross-default provisions that allow China to call all loans if one payment is missed. And collateral seizure mechanisms that activate automatically. These aren't development loans. They're predatory instruments designed to transfer assets from debtor to creditor when, not if, repayment fails. A team of researchers at Johns Hopkins analyzed 100 Chinese loan contracts. Their conclusion was unambiguous. These agreements give China leverage over borrower countries that is unprecedented in modern international finance. The climax isn't a single moment. It's happening right now. Across Africa, governments are quietly surrendering control of strategic assets. Zambia handed over its national broadcasting company after missing debt payments. Uganda is on the verge of losing Entebbe International Airport, the nation's primary gateway, because it cannot service a $207 million loan. The Democratic Republic of Congo signed away mineral rights to cobalt and copper mines, the raw materials for electric vehicle batteries, in exchange for debt relief. These nations didn't lose wars. They lost negotiations. The consequences are immediate and brutal. In Zambia, Chinese creditors now control the electricity grid. Power outages plague the country because maintenance is deprioritized to maximize profit extraction. In Pakistan, the cost of electricity has tripled because the government guaranteed Chinese energy companies a 17% rate of return, regardless of whether the power plants operate efficiently. Pakistani citizens pay the price, literally. Sovereignty is solvency, and when you're insolvent, your sovereignty belongs to your creditors. But the debt trap isn't just physical infrastructure. It's digital. China has exported its surveillance technology to over 80 countries. Facial recognition systems, internet monitoring software, social credit scoring platforms. These systems are often bundled into Belt and Road loans. A government borrows money for a highway and discovers the contract also includes a nationwide surveillance network. Once installed, these systems feed data back to Chinese servers, every face scanned, every message monitored, every dissident tracked, and the host government becomes dependent on Chinese technicians to maintain the systems. If you owe someone money and they control your communication networks, you don't have independence. You have a leash. The numbers tell the story. Between 2010 and 2020, Huawei and ZTE, Chinese telecommunications giants, built or upgraded networks in 170 countries. These aren't just phone lines. These are the backbones of national internet infrastructure, the cables that carry government communications, the towers that transmit military signals, and buried inside the hardware are backdoors, access points, kill switches. Western intelligence agencies have documented this repeatedly. In 2020, the U.S. State Department confirmed that Chinese-built networks in Africa contained surveillance capabilities that allowed Beijing to monitor heads of state. The ledger isn't just financial, it's informational. Control the data, and you control the decisions. Let that number sink in. 170 countries. More than 80% of the world's nations are running on Chinese-built digital infrastructure. If Beijing decides to flip a switch, entire economies could go dark. Banking systems frozen. Communication networks severed. Power grids shut down. And the countries affected would have no recourse because they signed contracts giving China operational control. This isn't a hypothetical. In 2012, China cut off rare earth mineral exports to Japan during a territorial dispute. Japan's high-tech manufacturing ground to a halt within weeks. The embargo lasted 2 months. Japan capitulated. The lesson was clear. Economic dependence is a weapon, and China has been stockpiling weapons for 2 decades. The aftermath is still unfolding, but the pattern is undeniable. Every nation that borrowed heavily from China is now facing a choice: pay the debt or pay with sovereignty. Some are trying to resist. Malaysia renegotiated $22 billion in Belt and Road projects in 2018, cutting costs by 30%. But Malaysia had leverage because it wasn't completely dependent. Most countries don't have that luxury. They borrowed because they had no other options. And now they're trapped in a cycle where the only way out is to borrow more. The average interest rate on Chinese loans is 4.2%. That's double the rate offered by Western development banks. But Western banks require transparency, environmental reviews, and anti-corruption measures. China requires none of that, just collateral and payment. By 2030, analysts estimate that debt payments to China will consume over $50 billion annually from developing nations. $50 billion flowing from the poorest countries on Earth to the second largest economy on the planet. That's not development aid. That's extraction. A resource transfer disguised as cooperation. And it's perfectly legal. Every contract was signed voluntarily. Every clause was agreed to. The fact that governments didn't understand what they were signing is irrelevant. Ignorance isn't a defense in contract law. The ledger demands payment, and the ledger always collects. Here's the part that should keep you awake at night. China isn't done. The Belt and Road Initiative is expanding into Latin America. Argentina borrowed $23 billion. Ecuador borrowed $18 billion. Venezuela, already drowning in debt, borrowed another $60 billion. These loans are structured the same way. High interest, hard collateral, operational control clauses. And every single one of them is denominated in dollars, not yuan. Why? Because China wants these countries to run out of dollars. When they do, they'll have to accept yuan. And once the global economy starts pricing commodities in yuan instead of dollars, the entire architecture of American financial power collapses. This isn't just about ports. It's about replacing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And it's working. The generational aftermath is already visible. Children born in Belt and Road countries will inherit economies structured around debt payments to China. Schools underfunded because education budgets are diverted to loan service. Hospitals under-equipped because healthcare spending is cut to meet payment schedules. Infrastructure crumbling because maintenance costs are sacrificed to keep creditors satisfied. This is the future China is building, not through conquest, through contract law. And the most terrifying part is that it's irreversible. Once you've signed away a port for 99 years, you don't get it back. Once you've handed over mineral rights for 3 generations, your grandchildren are born into servitude. The debt doesn't expire. It compounds. In 2019, the Center for Global Development identified 23 countries at high risk of debt distress from Chinese loans. By 2023, that number had risen to 44. The trajectory is clear. More nations falling, more assets seized, more sovereignty surrendered. And China keeps lending, because every default is an opportunity, every crisis is leverage. The worse the global economy performs, the more desperate nations become. And desperate nations sign whatever contract is put in front of them. This is conquest by spreadsheet. Victory through accounting. And it's the most successful imperial expansion in modern history, all without firing a shot. The lesson is simple. Debt is power, and power doesn't need permission. China understood what the West forgot. You don't need to invade a country to control it. You just need to own its balance sheet. When a nation owes you billions, you don't give orders. You don't need to. They come to you asking what you want. They restructure their policies to please you. They silence dissidents who criticize you. They vote with you in the United Nations. They allow your military ships to dock in their ports, all voluntarily, because the alternative is financial collapse. Sovereignty is solvency, and when you're insolvent, you belong to your creditors. So the next time someone tells you China is a rising threat, correct them. China has already risen. The threat isn't coming. It's here. The silent takeover isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a business model, and it's operating exactly as designed. Ports in 95 countries. Infrastructure projects in 150 nations. Surveillance systems in 80 governments. Debt obligations exceeding $838 billion. This is the largest transfer of sovereignty in human history, and most people still think the war hasn't started. The war is over. China won, not with missiles, with mortgages, not with soldiers, with accountants. The ledger has spoken, and the ledger never lies. If you want to understand the forces reshaping the world while everyone else is distracted by headlines about military exercises and trade disputes, subscribe. Because the real battles aren't fought on TV. They're fought in boardrooms, in contract negotiations, in debt restructuring agreements. And by the time those battles make the news, they're already over. The winner has already been decided by the numbers, always by the numbers. The ledger tells the truth, and the truth is China owns more of the world than any empire in history. They just don't need to plant flags to prove it. The debt is the flag, and it's flying over half the planet.